It was a quiet, sunny morning in what was supposed to be a peaceful neighborhood. The kind of place where people nodded politely at each other, kids rode their bikes in circles, and the biggest controversy was whether the mailman actually delivered on time. At least that's how it used to be, before Karen decided she was the queen of the cul-de-sac. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the neighbor. The one who appointed herself as the guardian of all things petty. Clipboard in hand, she prowled the sidewalks, eyes scanning for violations. A garden gnome? Outrageous. A car parked slightly over the imaginary line she had drawn in her head? Unacceptable. She had a list and she was checking it twice. Except this wasn't Christmas and Karen was far from Santa. I had lived in my home for years, minding my own business, tending to my lawn, and generally avoiding unnecessary drama. But Karen, she had a different plan. She strutted up to my driveway, her posture screaming self-importance, and pointed at my mailbox like it had personally offended her. "That's not regulation height," she said, her voice carrying the smug certainty of someone who had appointed herself HOA president. I blinked at her. "I'm not in the HOA." Her expression froze. It was the face of someone whose entire worldview had just been shaken, like telling a die-hard flat earther that globes exist. For a brief moment, I thought that would be the end of it. That logic would prevail and she'd move on to measuring someone else's mailbox. I was wrong. Because this wasn't just about rules. This was about control. And Karen? She wasn't about to let a non-member ruin her perfectly curated neighborhood dictatorship. This was only the beginning. The next day, I found a piece of paper taped to my front door. At first glance, it looked official, typed in bold font, with phrases like notice of violation and failure to comply. But a closer look revealed the sender. Karen, Neighborhood Standards Representative. Neighborhood Standards Representative? That wasn't a real title. Not in any legal sense. I sighed, peeling the paper off the door and reading her list of grievances. My trash cans had been left out 30 minutes too long after pickup. My grass was approximately half an inch taller than it should be. And, her personal favorite, the color of my front door was, in her words, unapproved and disruptive to the neighborhood aesthetic. It was beige. The same beige that half the houses on the street had. I crumpled the notice and tossed it in the trash, assuming that would be the end of it. But Karen wasn't one to let things go. That evening, she reappeared, clipboard in hand, tapping her pen against it like a drill sergeant preparing for battle. "I noticed you ignored the notice I left." I folded my arms. I didn't ignore it. I read it. Then I threw it away. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't optional. If you don't fix these violations, there will be consequences." "Like what?" I asked, genuinely curious how far she thought she could take this. She huffed, clearly expecting me to back down. "Fines. Possible legal action." I let out a short laugh. "Karen, I'm not in the HO. You have no authority over my property." The sheer horror on her face was priceless. She blinked rapidly, processing my words as if they were in a foreign language. "That doesn't matter," she said finally. "You live here. The rules apply to everyone." I was about to argue, but then I realized something. This wasn't about HOA regulations. It wasn't even about me. It was about Karen's desperate need to feel in charge, to wield whatever tiny sliver of authority she thought she had over the neighborhood. And unfortunately for me, I had just become her newest project that I could have ignored her. I could have gone about my life, pretending Karen and her clipboard didn't exist. But the thing about people like her? They thrive on a lack of resistance. Give them an inch and suddenly they're measuring your grass with a ruler and filing complaints about the shade of your mailbox. So, I decided to have a little fun. The next morning I repainted my front door. Not neon green as Karen might have feared, but the exact same shade of beige it had been before. Then I printed out a document with an official-looking letterhead and left it in my window. "This property is not governed by the HOA. Any complaints should be directed to the wind." It took exactly 2 hours for Karen to show up. She stood on the sidewalk, squinting at my door, then at the sign, then back at my door. She pulled out her phone, snapped a picture, and furiously typed something. Probably an email to an imaginary HOA board that held emergency meetings just to discuss my property. Later that evening, I got a text from my neighbor Tom. "Dude, Karen is fuming. She says you're mocking the integrity of the neighborhood." Integrity? Over a paint color that hadn't even changed? I laughed and texted back. "Did she measure my grass yet?" "Oh, she did." I peeked out my window and sure enough, there she was, standing in my yard, ruler in hand, dramatically inspecting my lawn like a detective at a crime scene. I stepped outside. "Karen, do you need help?" She jumped, caught red-handed in her ridiculous inspection. "Your grass is longer than regulation height," she snapped. I stared at her. "Again, not in the HO." She pursed her lips. "That doesn't mean you can just ignore community standards." I held back a grin. "Oh, I don't ignore them. I just interpret them creatively." She stormed off, muttering something about further action. I had no idea what that meant, but one thing was certain. Karen wasn't done with me yet. Word spread fast. By the next day, the entire street knew about the great HOA showdown between me and Karen. Some people found it hilarious. Others were cautiously watching from the sidelines, waiting to see who would come out victorious. Tom, my next-door neighbor, was the first to officially take my side. "Dude, she's losing it," he whispered conspiratorially as we stood by our mailboxes. "She came to my house last night and told me my porch light was too bright for neighborhood harmony." "What does that even mean?" "Did you ask her for the official lumens limit in the non-existent neighborhood rulebook?" I joked. "Oh, I did." She said, "Don't get smart with me, Tom." Apparently, I wasn't the only one Karen had been harassing. The old couple down the street got a sternly worded letter about their garden flamingos. A single mom got an earful about her kids leaving bikes in the driveway. And Tom? He got fined, yes, fined, for having his trash cans visible for more than 15 minutes after pickup. The best part? The fine was handwritten. By Karen. But not everyone was against her. A small group of self-important neighbors had started backing her up. The ones who nodded furiously at HOA meetings. The ones who whispered about maintaining standards while clutching their organic lattes. "She has a binder, man," Tom said, shaking his head. "A binder full of complaints." I nearly choked on my coffee. A binder. She calls it the neighborhood offenders list. This was getting ridiculous. It wasn't just about my grass anymore. It was a full-blown suburban Cold War. And while I had been perfectly fine with passive-aggressively resisting, I realized then that Karen wasn't going to stop until she either broke me or got her way. Which meant it was time to escalate. Karen wasn't slowing down. If anything, my refusal to bend to her imaginary rules only made her more determined. The complaint letters escalated. The clipboard became a permanent fixture in her hand. And then one fateful afternoon she did the unthinkable. She called 911. I was in my backyard enjoying a beer when I heard the sirens. Not one but two police cars rolled up in front of my house. For a split second I thought something serious had happened. Maybe a break-in, an accident, something that actually warranted this level of response. Nope. Karen stood in my driveway, arms crossed, lips pursed in satisfaction as the officers stepped out. One of them looked exhausted, like he had already decided this was a waste of time. I set my beer down and walked over. "Is there a problem, officers?" One of them sighed. "She claims you're trespassing." I blinked. "On my own property?" Karen stepped forward. "This land is governed by the HO. He is in violation and refuses to comply. If he won't follow the rules, he shouldn't be allowed to live here." The officer rubbed his temples. "Ma'am, we don't handle HOA disputes." "It's not a dispute. It's law," she screeched, waving her ever-present clipboard like it was the Constitution. I crossed my arms, barely holding back laughter. "Officer, I own this property. I'm not in the HOA." The second officer glanced at Karen. "Ma'am, is he legally bound to HOA rules?" "Well, technically, no, but..." The first officer immediately turned to me. "You're free to go." I grinned. "Awesome. Since I'm already home, I think I'll stay." Karen's face turned a shade of red I had previously only seen on malfunctioning electronics. "But he's ruining the neighborhood." The officer gave her a long, tired look. "Ma'am, unless he's committing a crime, you can't keep calling the police over personal grievances." That's when it happened. The ultimate moment of defeat. The officer handed her a warning for misuse of emergency services. Tom, who had come outside to watch the spectacle, let out an audible oath like we were at a rap battle. Karen stood frozen, her mind clearly short-circuiting at the realization that she had lost. And just like that, the tide turned the moment Karen got that warning. Something in the neighborhood shifted. It was as if everyone had been holding their breath, waiting for her to finally push things too far. And she had. The police leaving without so much as a second glance at me was the first domino to fall. The next was the HOA meeting. Now, I normally wouldn't have bothered attending an HOA meeting since, I wasn't in the HOA. But after Karen's spectacular 911 meltdown, my neighbor Tom convinced me that this particular meeting was worth witnessing. "She's losing it, man," he whispered as we walked into the community center. "She's trying to get them to extend HOA authority to non-member homes for the greater good." I nearly choked on my water. "That's not even legally possible." "Oh, she knows that. But she thinks if she throws a big enough tantrum, they'll just let her do it. And oh boy did she try." Karen stood at the front of the room, binder in hand, dramatically flipping through pages as she ranted about community integrity and unified standards, and problematic residents. When she gestured vaguely in my direction, I gave her a cheerful wave. The HOA board members, bless their tired souls, were done. One of them, an older man who looked like he had survived multiple Karens in his lifetime, sighed deeply and adjusted his glasses. "Karen," he said in the tone of a father who had been called to the principal's office too many times because of his kid, "we cannot govern properties that are not part of the HOA." "But they should be," she argued. "If we let him get away with whatever he wants, then everyone will think they can just ignore the rules." Someone in the back muttered, "Because they can." A few chuckles followed. The HOA president sighed again and rubbed his temples. "Karen, this is not up for debate. And frankly, we've had multiple complaints about you overstepping your authority." Her face went pale. "Excuse me." A woman from the board, clearly holding back amusement, pulled out a stack of papers. "We received several reports about you issuing fake violation notices, attempting to fine residents without proper authorization, and," she paused, raising an eyebrow, "calling the police over grass height?" Karen sputtered. "That was an emergency." The HOA president ignored her. "Effective immediately, you are removed from any neighborhood committees. You are no longer authorized to distribute notices, warnings, or fines. If you continue, you will be the one facing penalties." The silence in the room was deafening. Karen opened her mouth, closed it, then grabbed her precious binder and stormed out, knocking over a plastic chair in the process. The door slammed behind her, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt at peace. And just to celebrate, that weekend half the street put up inflatable lawn decorations, gaudy, over-the-top, HOA violating Christmas decorations. Even in the middle of July, life in the neighborhood returned to normal. Or at least, a version of normal that didn't involve Karen lurking around with a clipboard, searching for crimes against suburban perfection. People started leaving their trash cans out a little longer, garden gnomes multiplied like a cheerful little army, and Tom's cat reclaimed his rightful place on every lawn in the cul-de-sac. As for Karen, she laid low for a while. At first she still stomped around the neighborhood, arms crossed, muttering under her breath whenever she saw a violation she could no longer do anything about. But without her fake authority and without anyone taking her seriously, she was just a grumpy lady with too much time on her hands. And then one day she was gone. The official word was that she and her husband moved to a more structured community, which we all interpreted as an HOA where she could rule unchallenged. No one threw a going-away party, but Tom and I did share a celebratory drink in our driveways when the moving truck finally disappeared down the street. The best part? The HOA never bothered me again. Not a single passive-aggressive letter, not one ridiculous demand. Turns out the actual board members weren't interested in picking unnecessary fights with homeowners who weren't even under their jurisdiction. They just wanted Karen to stop giving them headaches. So the neighborhood was peaceful once more. And to make sure it stayed that way, I made a small addition to my front yard. A mailbox decal that read "Not in the HOA," just in case another Karen ever thought about trying me.